From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros, Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. Our guest today is Alex Aviña. He is Associate Professor of Latin American History at Arizona State University. He specializes in Mexican history. His book, published in 2014, is called Specters of Revolution: Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. And currently, he's working on a book called A War Against Poor People: Dirty Wars, Narcotics, and the Cold War Roots of Mexico's Contemporary Drug Violence. Welcome, Alex. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for the invitation, Alberto. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being on. So, in the US, of course, right now we're recording on Friday, March 7, and on the news in the US is US-Mexico relations. Claudia Sheinbaum is Mexico's president. She was elected last year in 2024. And Sheinbaum is a member of the Morena party, a party that was founded by the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or as he's typically referred to by his initials, AMLO. And Mexican presidents are elected for a single 6-year term. So unlike in the US, where there's 2 4-year terms, they have a single 6-year term. That system emerged after the Mexican Revolution. But we saw in the 20th century that one party, known by its initials, the PRI, dominated the political system. And then you had electoral reforms that led to, in the year 2000, another party winning the presidency, and this was the party known as the PAN. And that party won the presidency for 2 terms. The PRI comes back. During that time, AMLO was running for president and didn't succeed in winning the presidency in 2006. In 2012, he complained about fraud, electoral fraud. But he comes in 2018, winning by a large majority or a significant majority. And he leaves office in 2024, being very popular generally with the Mexican people, and his support for Claudia Sheinbaum helped her win by an even bigger margin. So talk about AMLO's presidency and why he was popular during a time during time of COVID, when in other countries you see that incumbents suffered. AMLO was able to maintain his popularity through COVID. So talk about his policies.
So AMLO was a long-standing member of the Mexican political scene from the 1990s on. I think the most position that he occupied is in the early 2000s when he was mayor of Mexico City. And some of the programs that he initiated while he was mayor of Mexico City, he will then replicate on the national level when he won the presidency in 2018. But so all to say that he was already a popular political figure known nationally within the center left, right? He used to be a member of the PRD, which has an interesting history of its own. But so he in 2006 he runs for the presidency and he loses as a candidate for the PRD, and he loses by less than a percentage point. And this is when he claims that electoral fraud had been committed, and that's what cost him the presidency, and that the fraud had been committed by the PAN and their victorious candidate Felipe Calderon. Felipe Calderon is remembered now as the president who started the latest version of Mexico's so-called war on drugs. And it's really Calderon's presidency from 2006 to 2012 when he decides to more or less unleash the Mexican military onto different spots of the country to fight against different drug trafficking organizations, that we start to see the spike in violence throughout the country. At the same time that he followed through some and applied some pretty unpopular, more right-wing neoliberal economic policies to that also combined with the higher levels of violence to really make him and his party extremely unpopular by the time we get to the 2010s. And this is what provides space for the PRI to return to party with a very, I wouldn't say charismatic, but let's say a television-friendly candidate in the form of Enrique Peña Nieto, whose whole entire mantra, he got really favorable media coverage internationally as the guy who was going to save Mexico, as a Time magazine cover announced in 2013. And he helped bring the three political parties that were dominant in the Mexican politics to in this thing that they referred to as a pact to save Mexico, which was essentially a series of more neoliberal economic measures that intended to privatize Mexican oil, to privatize Mexican education as a way to get out of some of the long-standing structural deficiencies of the Mexican economy that we can trace all the way back to the early 80s, when Mexico became the biggest country at that time to default on its loans. And it led to a pretty disastrous economic situation for much of the 80s and early 90s. What derails Enrique Peña Nieto's presidency is this infamous incident that happens in September of 2014 when 43 rural teacher training school students were disappeared in the state of Guerrero. And that's what really disrupted the narrative of triumphalist narrative around Enrique Peña Nieto as the guy who was going to save Mexico. And that really stopped a lot of the reforms that he was trying to implement. And I mention all this because this is what provides a space for AMLO to once again reemerge as a viable political candidate at this moment, having founded his own independent political party that is now known as Morena. And one of the things that I also want to mention is that Morena begins not just as a splinter group from the center-left PRD group, but it begins also with some social movement origins. So that's something that I think helps explain the power of Morena to this very day, that it wasn't just a political party, but it saw itself as a social movement becoming a political party. That combined with the popularity of Andrés Manuel López Obrador really gave it a lot of its political power when he decides to run for president for a third time in 2018, and he wins just this overwhelming electoral victory. And it was on the promises of some very progressive socioeconomic and political policies. During his campaign, he was very explicit about wanting to fight against Donald Trump. He was very explicit about approaching the drug issue and the narco trafficking issue in a more radical, progressive way that explored kind of like the socioeconomic roots of the issue and not just focusing on militarizing the conflict and going after criminals associated with international drug trafficking. And it's complicated when we want to step back and assess his presidency, because a lot of what he said he was going to do, like any typical politician, he didn't do. Once he took office, he realized that he had certain limitations that he had to deal with. He didn't follow through with that progressive approach to the drug trafficking and drug production issue. He actually got along relatively well with Donald Trump. They found a way to get along. And another thing that AMLO did was to create something called the National Guard, which was supposed to be like a federal police force that was supposed to be used against drug trafficking organizations, but ends up being used mostly to like police undocumented migrants and refugees that are coming from Central America and from the Caribbean. Nonetheless, like AMLO is extremely popular throughout his 6-year term on the strength of some of his social reforms and social policies that he implemented, on a very sound fiscal policy that actually strengthened the Mexican peso. And there was a whole discourse of like the super peso, that it maintained its value relative to the US dollar. And really one of his most popular social programs was this pension program where elders, Mexican elderly peoples, students, people with special needs got money, got funds, got support from the federal government. And that's a program that continues to this day, and it's actually been amplified and consolidated by the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum. So despite some, despite some contradictions, despite some a very combative, feisty public style, I know AMLO had this tendency to pick unnecessary fights and to keep grudges, and then to, he had one of his innovations, I think, was to give a daily press conference in the morning called the Mañanera, where he addressed the country and a group of journalists for about 2.5 hours, and it really allowed him to control the narrative and to engage in a direct communication with the Mexican people. But he also had this tendency to like hold grudges and to pick weird, unnecessary fights, which I always found kind of unproductive, but that was his style. And also his handling of the COVID situation was extremely problematic. It led to one of the highest death counts in the world with relation to COVID. But nonetheless, he leaves office with a high popularity rating. He leaves office with his political party really becoming hegemonic. That is, it's starting to expand its power, not just politically and economically, but also socially and culturally, where a vast majority of Mexicans are actually behind this political party that actually isn't very old. And that really serves as a foundation for Claudia Sheinbaum's overwhelming victory last year, where she broke all sorts of records when it came to the margin of victory that was just unprecedented. It wiped out all of the opposition political parties that are united to try to stop her presidency.
Yeah, and her presidency is only 5 months old, but so far, what have you seen from her in comparison to AMLO? Where do you see the continuities? Where do you see some differences in terms of policy and style? So talk about that.
Yeah, she had to navigate a really interesting situation during a campaign where the opposition tried to paint her as just like a puppet of AMLO, where so she did a lot of work to create her political persona as independent and separate from AMLO, while at the same time saying like, I'm a believer in his legacy and his project. I'm a believer in Morena, and I'm going to further those policies and those ideas, but I'm different. I'm my own person, and I have a different political style. So I think she's done that relatively successful while, using a different political style. She comes from a different political trajectory. She was a student organizer and student protester during the 1980s. She's an environmental scientist. She comes on both sides of her family. She comes from a line of Jewish communists and members of the Mexican Communist Party. So she has a different political trajectory, also a different like generational trajectory than when AMLO came into being as a political person. But she's kept a lot of the most popular reforms and actually has amplified them and tried to consolidate them and make them part of the Mexican Constitution. She's also announced programs on her own initiative. So one of the more ambitious one being this the building of more than 1 million homes, right? So she's for people who need housing, right? This is an instance of social housing where you would create housing not based on the logic of a capitalist market, but based on need and what people are demanding, right? So that's one of her initiatives that she's announced early on in her presidency since the last year. But in other respects, she's just continuing and furthering some of the more popular social and economic policies that the AMLO administration had passed during his time in office. And I think, right off the bat, she's had to deal with the United States. My father uses a verb to describe how she has to negotiate with Trump, and he says that he has to torear, which means kind of like you're bullfighting, and she's had to quote unquote bullfight Trump. And I think what we've seen in the recent debates and fight over the tariff threat, she's actually done, I think, as good a job as possible in preventing Trump from implementing a tariff policy that would devastate the Mexican economy. It would devastate the American economy as well. But she's done a really interesting, effective job at communicating with Trump and then reaching some sort of an agreement where those tariffs are never implemented while giving up very little. And so to that extent, I think she's done a pretty effective job in trying to protect Mexican economic and national sovereignty in relation to a political movement and party in the United States that's talking about tariffs, that's talking about designated Mexican drug trafficking organization a terrorist organization. That, since 2023, Republicans were talking about invading Mexico and doing all sorts of unilateral military operations in the country. So considering that broader context, I think she's done a pretty effective job at protecting Mexico, especially when you compare it to what the Canadians have been doing, right? And that offers us kind of like a counterpoint in terms of how to deal with and handle Trump. But I think in the end, just like with AMLO and just like with every Mexican president since at least the 60s and 70s, Mexico has leverage over the United States. And that leverage is in the form of a 2,000-mile long border and in the form of migration from the global south, from Latin America and the Caribbean into the United States.
Right, right. And the US and Mexican economies are deeply connected, and that's grown since the passage of NAFTA, which was approved in 1994. And it was revised during Trump's first term, but it would mostly remain the same. So last year, the US imported from Mexico more goods in terms of value than any other country, more than China. Mexico exceeded China in terms of imports going into the US. The Mexican economy now is a top 15 world economy. So on the US side, since NAFTA passed, there have been critics of NAFTA talking about how it's cost manufacturing jobs, and that's an argument that Trump has made and which has been effective politically in some parts of the country. But let's look at NAFTA from the Mexican side, from the Mexican perspective, which is not often talked about in the US, or pretty much not never talked about or rarely talked about. So how did NAFTA impact the Mexican economy? You mentioned about the troubles in the 80s and early 90s. And who's benefited the most from NAFTA, and who has been hurt over the last 30 plus years since NAFTA in Mexico?
Yeah, I think NAFTA is part of a broader process of uneven economic development that has characterized the country since that debt default in 1982, which for Mexico to escape that economic catastrophe, it had to essentially neoliberalize its economy, right? It had to um, minimize or mitigate labor and environmental regulations. It had to open its markets. It had to get rid of tariffs. It had to, in a way, it had to go back in time to a previous moment in Mexican history where the emphasis shifted away from, let's say, the development of an internal market based on rapid industrialization in the manufacturing sector, and to become more of an export-oriented economy that was feeding, the U.S. and Western European economies. So what NAFTA does is essentially it's a culmination of, let's say, 10 to 12 years of the country experiencing what economists at the time referred to as structural realignment, right? The Mexican economy had to be opened up and it had to be reoriented in relation to the United States. And it had to become a area that had to attract foreign direct investment. So how do they do that? They reduce labor costs. They get rid of environmental regulations, or at least they don't apply them. And they try to foster like a favorable investment climate in Mexico. And obviously that's going to help Mexican capitalists. It's going to help a certain sector at the very top of the population. Something that we saw in Mexico in the late 80s was the selling off of a lot of national publicly owned companies in really shady no bid processes, where the private individuals who bought formerly state owned companies were able to do so because they had some sort of shady or friendly relationships with high ranking PRI officials. So for instance, to give an example, Mexico had a national telecommunications sector, Telmex. It was a common public good, but it was sold off in a no bid contract below market cost to a guy by the name of Carlos Slim, because he was tight with the PRI leadership. And that becomes the foundation of the economic empire of one of the wealthiest men in the world. So you have this process in the late 80s, early 90s, where the vast majority of the Mexican population is going through economic depression and recession, but you also see the production of the exponential production of new millionaires, because these are the people who are benefiting from the buying of formerly state-owned companies at reduced below market cost. And then NAFTA kind of codifies that into a North American free trade agreement. And it does help, again, certain sectors of the Mexican economy. It helps the bosses, it helps the capitalists at the top. But by opening up the Mexican economy fully to certain US goods, like, say, corn, American corn growers who are getting massive federal subsidies from the US government, their products would now be allowed to come into the Mexican market and flood the Mexican market. And that wiped out the small peasant holding class and producers of corn in the 1990s. So in the countryside, NAFTA tended to have a pretty devastating effect, particularly in the small and middling agricultural sector. People were not able to make, to be able to make any sort of economic livelihood in the countryside. So many people migrated to Mexican cities. Others migrated or tried to migrate to the United States. But that NAFTA was a dual movement, though, because at the same time that you have the opening up of economies and the circulation of capital and commodities in North America, at the same time, the other movement was the hardening and the building of new border walls and a more intense process of border militarization, because the architects of NAFTA anticipated that the entry of US agricultural goods into the Mexican market was going to displace Mexican peasants, and Mexican peasants were going to then migrate and go to the United States. Bill Clinton and his people anticipated that movement. And this is why in 93 and 94, you get a new process of border militarization, building of border walls around major transnational urban crossing sites, and this plan that the Border Patrol implemented of prevention through deterrence, where they essentially militarized deadly landscapes like the Sonoran Desert, where I live in, with the idea that if you militarize these urban crossing points, you're forcing people, or you're funneling them into dangerous areas so dangerous from the Border Patrol's logic is that no one would attempt a crossing through those areas. We now know that's not what happened, right? We have a low estimate is something like 10,000 people have died trying to cross the US-Mexico border from 1993 till today. The likely number is exponentially much higher. We just don't have a way to account for it. Groups like No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, their count is much higher in terms of body count. So that was the impact of NAFTA, right? So NAFTA produced a lot of a pretty robust group at the very top of Mexican society, of new millionaires and new billionaires. But that economic development was extremely uneven the farther down you get into the Mexican class structure. And it did plunder the Mexican countryside. It did displace many Mexican peasants and rural folks from the countryside into Mexican cities and into the United States. And actually, economic growth was not that big. It wasn't that sustained from the 90s into the 2000s. So in many instances, the promises of NAFTA were never fulfilled, and the consequences were heightened socioeconomic inequality throughout most of the country. You also see this expressed geographically, right? So certain Mexican cities did get more investment. You do see the beginnings of a quote unquote Mexican Silicon Valley, like in the central region, like around Jalisco, north of Jalisco. But again, this development was highly uneven, and it was based on cheaper labor costs in Mexico versus the United States, or even versus China.
Yes, yes. And in terms of migration, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a significant shift in that before that, most of those crossing the border from Mexico to the US were Mexicans. And they remain a significant portion of those crossing. But in the last 10, 15 years, we saw it switch where the majority of people crossing are now coming from outside of Mexico, coming from Central America, South America, and more recently now even from Africa and Asia, right? And that's something now the Mexican government has had to deal with on its southern border and those arriving on plane. So how has the Mexican government dealt with these new migrants who are trying to get to the US through Mexico?
Yeah, this is one of these approaches cuts across different presidential administrations and across different political ideologies and political differences amongst political parties. And I say that because for decades now, the Mexico has essentially served as like the border police for Mexico. I mean, Mexico has served as the border police for the United States. Sorry. The United States, since the 80s and 1990s, has tried to externalize its borders beyond its actual physical borders to southern Mexico or to places like Haiti, right? The Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico become a watery border, and they try to externalize the border to Haiti, to Cuba, to the Dominican Republic, etc. And in that process, Mexico has served as the border police for the United States for several decades now. And this is a process that really intensifies after 9/11 and really under the auspices of like war on terror discourse to justify essentially increased US funding for like different Mexican police forces that will be engaged in the interdiction of migrants. And then you have a nice little convergence with like anti-drug stuff, right? So it all gets like mangled together. So when I think about 2015, 2016, when Trump said that he was going to make Mexico build and pay for a border wall, well, Mexico became the border wall. So we didn't get the wall as he promised, but the Calderon administration, the Peña Nieto administration, the AMLO administration, and the Sheinbaum administration to this day are continuing to serve in that capacity, where they are still receiving U.S. assistance to build migrant prisons in southern Mexico, to train, quote unquote, train and arm the National Guard and the Mexican National Guard to serve as kind of like a migrant police force. This entire Trumpian approach to migrants in the form of the Remain in Mexico policy or Title 42 or Biden's essentially abolition or dramatic reduction of refugee and asylum rights. All these U.S. based policies depend on Mexico collaborating with them, whether explicitly or implicitly. No U.S. migrant policy will work, anti-migrant, anti-refugee policy will work if it doesn't have buy-in and support from Mexico. And Mexico continues to fill that role. I mean, that was one of my criticisms of both the AMLO administration, and it's a criticism that I'll continue with the Sheinbaum administration. Although I think she's tried to, I think at least rhetorically, she's trying to signal that she's attempting to try something different from AMLO, but I don't see it in practice. One of the reasons why for the last year we've seen some of the lowest, what the term that the U.S. Border Patrol uses is migrant encounters at the border. It's about a year now. We've seen some of the lowest numbers in the history of the Border Patrol in terms of keeping track of this. And it's not because people aren't coming. People are still coming. People are still being displaced throughout the global South for a variety of different reasons, whether it's U.S.-based economic warfare and sanctions, or the ravages of climate change, or local state authoritarian governments. People are still coming. The thing is that Mexico has become this labyrinth of like militarized anti-migrant checkpoints, and they get picked up before they can make it to the U.S.-Mexico border. So this is one of the weird things about Trump picking on Mexico and threatening tariffs. Like, Mexico is doing a lot of the work that's allowing him to claim victory that migrants aren't coming. And this is one of the contradictions between U.S. policy and Mexico policy with regards to refugee, asylum, and migrant policies. But I guess the quote unquote dirty little secret is that they're both collaborating with one another. And that's what enables a particular US based political approach to migrants, in which the Americans are allowed to pretend that migrants only miraculously materialize or appear once they make it to the US Mexico border. If they don't make it there, well, out of sight, out of mind, and we don't have to worry about it, even if the idea continues to fuel really revanchist, nativist, white supremacist ideas in US political discourse. But again, the secret is that without Mexico, the Trumpian policy does not work. Without Mexico serving as kind of like this border police for the US, Biden's policy wouldn't have worked. So on both sides of the border, you see continuities regardless of political ideology or differences. The continuity is the same. Both countries are following a particular policy or approach that really brutalizes people, that brutalizes migrants, that brutalizes people, refugees and asylum seekers, who in many cases are just trying to assert their international Mexican and US based rights to claim asylum, to seek safety, to seek refuge. And from my perspective, what's unfortunate about that is that Mexico has a long tradition of doing it the another way. Right? Mexico in the 1930s under President Lázaro Cárdenas accepted tens of thousands of Spanish refugees, Republican refugees, who lost the Spanish Civil War to the fascists, and they fled their country. And something like 30 to 40,000 of them were granted refuge by President Lázaro Cárdenas. And those Spanish exiles then became really important. Um, they played a really important role in the world of culture and academia and pedagogy and education in Mexico. Um, Mexico did something similar in the 1960s and 70s when a lot of Latin American countries fell to military dictatorships. Mexico accepted hundreds, perhaps thousands of exiles from Argentina, from Brazil, from Uruguay, from Chile, who were escaping military dictatorships to seek refuge in Mexico. And then something similar happens in the 80s with Central America and some of the consequences, the displacement of people as a consequence of US based support for genocidal death squad regimes. So like there are traditions that Mexico can draw from that teaches them to deal with refugees and migrants in a different, more progressive, more humane way. But because of politics and political relationships with the US, they've decided to do something different.
So the US and Mexico are linked through the drug trade because the US is the world's largest consumer of drugs, legal and illegal drugs. So this is a topic that's on the forefront of discussions today. Donald Trump claims to be imposing these tariffs on Mexico, so it does more in terms of preventing the drug trade. There's rumblings by Republicans about using U.S. military force in Mexico against the drug cartels. A lot of Americans, their perception of Mexico is that it's this narco state controlled by cartels. So, but what's the reality here? You mentioned how a previous president, Felipe Calderón, used the military against the cartels, and that just created more violence. There's reports about under Scheinbaum, more aggressive action being taken using the military. So this is a topic that I know you've focused on. So let's look at the last couple decades in terms of the so-called drug war and its impact on Mexico specifically.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that, Alberto. I mean, definitely what I tell my students is that the US is the world's largest narco state. And then I usually give them statistics about the consumption of illicit and illicit drugs. And then I show them a famous image or infamous image of Pablo Escobar and his young son taking a picture in front of the White House from like 1984 when they were here as tourists. Um, yeah, so a couple things to think about the drug trade. The U. This is a history that goes back more than 100 years, right? I mean, it's U.S. demand for illicit and illicit drug drives the creation of an illicit drug market in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution to this very day. I mean, that's the dynamic that fuels it. What we've seen in the last 10 or so years is an additional dynamic that contributes to the horrific levels of violence that we have seen in Mexico. And that is something like 75% of all high grade weapons, military weapons that these drug trafficking organizations use come from the United States. Right. So Mexico is caught in this pretty murderous dual movement where it's US demand for illicit drugs drives the creation of an illicit drug market, production, and drug trafficking organizations. And then those same drug trafficking organizations are armed to the teeth by overwhelmingly mostly US weaponry. Um, you know, one of the changes that we've seen in the drug trade and in the relationship between different drug trafficking organizations is that you do see a paramilitarization of the conflict beginning in the late 90s and early 2000s. Usually what scholars will point to is this moment in the late 90s where dozens of the most highly trained Mexican special forces troops will defect. They will abandon the Mexican military and they will lend themselves out to working for a group called the Gulf Cartel. And they will become kind of like the paramilitary wing of that cartel, and they will call themselves the Zetas, the Z's. We don't really hear about them as much. They're a drug trafficking organization that has splintered into many different groups. They're mostly geographically located in northeastern Mexico. But in the early 2000s, they were kind of like the innovators with a lot of the type of violence that we see now, more militarized types of violence, everything from like the dress to the use of weaponry to the use of terror tactics and the display of bodies, murdered bodies publicly to as a way of communicating terror and as a way of communicating in general with their rivals. A lot of that stuff really starts in the early 2000s as a consequence of the paramilitarization of this conflict. So what the Mexican government does in 2006 under Felipe Calderon was to add to the paramilitarization by then using the Mexican military to fight against these forces. And one of the things that happens is that, really the Mexican military will be sent into different parts of the country, and theoretically they're supposed to attack drug trafficking organizations that are located in these geographies and then attack drug cultivation. But there's a longer history, 20th century history of what happens when these military units arrive at the local scene. Is what happens is that they interface with local power elites and local drug traffickers, and they find a way to get along, and they find a way to kind of create some sort of stable political order at the local level, in which you have the military and the police working with local criminal elites. And they create a form of sovereignty that really depends on narcos and narco violence as a form of political resource that gets used between these different groups. So they're not actually attacking drug cultivation. They're not actually attacking drug trafficking organizations. This becomes a form of establishing like the state sovereignty at the local level. And this speaks to like a longer history of Mexican state formation and it's, some of the nuances of this history and this political process is obviously left out in U.S. political discourse. Most Americans and American politicians will say, oh, actually it's, Mexico's a narco state and it's been taken over by narcos. It's much more complicated than that. And there is no way that any of these drug trafficking organizations are more powerful than the Mexican military, regardless of what opposition figures in Mexico say or what American politicians say. So one of the things, this militarized approach to dealing with drug production and drug trafficking just creates and generates even more violence, particularly when you have the Mexican military. They're not going out there to arrest people per se. They're going out there to shoot and to kill. And we've seen this over and over again, and innocent people have been caught in the crossfire. But, the broader strategy of how to deal with drugs in this militarized variety is to go for the leadership of a particular drug trafficking organization and to take them out. And then the argument is you take out the leadership, that organization is somehow going to fall apart. The organization may fall apart, but it actually will fragment into different groups, smaller groups that then start to compete for power at that local and state level. And that generates even more violence. You also have a DEA strategy of trying to turn one, quote, kingpin against another. And you're trying to get one kingpin to turn in or to spy on or to inform on another one. This creates massive levels of distrust within the world of narco trafficking. That generates even more violence. So, to give one really quick example, the state of Guerrero, which is the state that I research, for decades, it was really under the control of like Sinaloa-based traffickers. Once the leadership of the Sinaloa-based trafficking group was taken out, you had massive fragmentation of the drug trafficking economy in the state of Guerrero, to the point where like you could almost every municipality had their own different group, or different groups were trying to invade other municipalities and to take power. Now, in the 2000s and the 2010s, Guerrero was a big deal because it was the main site of heroin production in the country. And heroin was the drug of choice that was making it into the United States. So this is why, so that only created even more violence, because there was a lot of profit driving the violence of these different groups who were trying to control the production of heroin up in the mountains of Guerrero. Well, the market for heroin kind of falls out in 2016, 2017 when fentanyl replaces it. And fentanyl is a totally different type of drug, right? You don't need fields, you don't need flowers, you don't need the mountains to produce this thing. What you need are precursor chemicals coming from other parts of the world. you need some labs, and then you need to smuggle this drug into the United States. So that also changes the dynamic of this political economy of narcotics, and it also stimulates even more violence. So all to say is that every process, every strategy that the Mexican state has adopted in the last 20, 25 years, and every strategy that the U.S. government has supported or furthered in Mexico has led to just more and more and more violence. And this is why to this day we have more than 500,000 homicides since the year 2006, and we have more than 100,000 people disappeared from beginning in 2006. And a lot of people, many people have been impacted by this in some way. Like my own uncle was disappeared in April of 2007. And it just, when our state in Michoacan, where my family's from, was under, they had different warring factions that were trying to control this particular part of the state. So, this is one of the reasons why I think AMLO wins so overwhelmingly in 2018 is because he was promising a new approach. And this new approach gets categorized under the slogan of abrazos no balazos, like hugs, not bullets. That never actually became a thing. Like he continued the militarized approach to drug interdiction, but for some reason, people in the media, both in Mexico and the United States, took it as if it had been applied. So one of the ways that they would attack AMLO was to say, oh, he's soft on drug traffickers, when in reality, very few, like almost nothing had changed on the ground. And the Mexican military continued its really violent approach to dealing with drug interdiction. At the same time that segments of the Mexican military are collaborating in direct or indirect ways with certain drug trafficking groups. So this is it's a really complicated story, right? And right now with the tariffs, you have nationalistic chest thumping on both sides, on Mexico and the United States. But like the more covert aspect, you still have collaboration between the two countries when it comes to dealing with the issue of drugs. So for instance, we have reports that the U.S. has been flying drones over Mexican territory. And once that, following different drug traffickers, once that information kind of leaked, Sheinbaum then allowed her to make this really nationalistic pitch to say, we're going to increase and protect Mexican sovereignty, and we're actually going to make changes to the Mexican Constitution to protect our sovereignty. But then again, on the more secret covert side, well, not even secret, but on the more like understated side, we have U.S. special forces coming to Mexico. This was approved by AMLO before he left office. You have U.S. special forces from Fort Bragg coming to Mexico to train Mexican Marines in some really advanced anti-drug, anti-whatever. I can be really cynical about this, but I'll just say anti-drug interdiction. It's my understanding that it's the very same special forces group that had in the 1990s provided the training for many of the Mexican special forces that defected and then became part of the Zetas. So it's like this weird, like they haven't learned their lesson type of thing. But again, this is more understated. So you do have military to military relationships that are still happening, while publicly you see a lot of, particularly on the American side and with Trump, a lot of launching of threats. But fundamentally, to go back to the question, what's driving the violence in Mexico, and it has been driving it for decades, and especially since 2006, is this insatiable U.S. demand for illicit drugs. And at the same time, the arming to the teeth of these different drug trafficking organizations by U.S. gun makers and gun manufacturers, which is why the Mexican government has been, I think it made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, or is about to, this lawsuit that the Mexican government has filed against different U.S. gun manufacturers and trying to hold them responsible for fueling the violence in Mexico. But as long as that demand of for U.S. drugs is not met, if there isn't a deeper interrogation on the U.S. side of the border as to why so many people feel the need to use illicit drugs, why drugs represent some sort of quote unquote quick fix, to borrow from a recent book that came out by Ben Fong called Quick Fixes, then we're going to have the same levels of violence continue. And this is a problem, again, that Mexico can't fix on its own. Even if Sheinbaum and AMLO had adopted more progressive policies, the fact that you still have that U.S. demand, it's going to continue to fuel a lot of the conflict. So this solution is going to have to be binational or transnational. And we just haven't seen a serious effort to engage this issue, this problem on that level. Fundamentally, we need to interrogate why people in the US are using so many drugs, both licit and illicit, because that's the main driver.
Right. Well, thank you, Alex, for being on the show, and I hope we can talk again in the future. These are our
Yeah,
important topics that we can go into even more depth into in the
yes.
future. So
Anytime.
thank you,
Thank you so
Alex.
much for thank you for the invitation, Alberto. This was great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.